Good evening, everybody. Seems like such an intimate crowd. Here I am speaking on this, but it's because we've got people joining us online. My name is Nancy Easterling. It's my pleasure to have you here tonight. I'm the executive director here at Historic Sotterley, and we do have 99 people registered to join us online, but you're the ones who get cookie and wine. So sorry, guys, for you that you who are online. I was thinking the other day that this is the 20th year we have had a speaker series here at Sotterley. There were a few speakers that happened before 2006, but in 2006, we decided to start it back up, and it was 2 or 3 speakers a year. And now we are up to this many speakers. It's been incredible. We want to be able to continue these for the future. So if you know of people that want to sponsor next year will be our 250th anniversary, of course, national recognition. And we really want to do some amazing speakers. We've already got some plans. So if you know of anybody who'd want to sponsor, please let us know. But I want to thank one of our sponsors right now, Whiteford Systems, Brooke Whiteford in the back. He is the reason that you can hear me, that all of this works, and that those of us can join online. So Brooks, thank you so much for all that you do for us. You're incredible, really. Thank you so much. And we are live streaming this, so if you are joining us online tonight, please sign into the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Do know that you are going to be able to take part in the question and answer. You can put your questions in at any time. Put them in when you're thinking about it so you don't forget at the end. Catherine Humphreys, our Interpretive Programs Manager, will be able to take your questions along with the questions in the room at the end. This event is actually part of a larger event going on here in Southern Maryland. Our St. Mary's County Public Libraries is sponsoring an exhibit that there is a National World on the Move exhibit and we are hosting it here in this county for this month. You were one of the kickoff events, Mr. Tayzhuan. So we are so excited to be part of that. Please go on the library website, look at all the events that are taking place. This is talking about helping people appreciate how migration habits have really shaped us, shaped who we have been, shaped who we are becoming, and really understanding that. So check on that a little bit more. When Catherine Humphreys, our Interpretive Programs Manager, who I'm going to let introduce our speaker tonight, met him, he didn't realize, but from the first time she came back in the office, she said, he's coming back for a speaker series. She knew. I have heard him speak in other places. I am just so excited. We're all going to learn so much. But before I talk any more about him, let me get Catherine Humphreys up here so that she can do a proper introduction.
So I get to play with the microphone tonight. I'm usually not allowed to have technology. It's a little scary. Last year, Dr. Glover came to Sotterley for a tour, and it started a dialogue about the importance of events like the War of 1812 and the migration of people and the pursuit of freedom. And as we head into the 250th, the pursuit of freedom becomes this bigger theme and the perspective surrounding the word freedom and what it means to different audiences. But tonight's speaker, Dr. Tayzhuan Glover, received a PhD in history from Duke University in 2024, so it's still shiny and new. That's exciting. He received his bachelor's in Africana Studies, Anthropology, and French from Franklin and Marshall College in 2017. That is a lot. He is primarily interested in the seaborne mobility practices of freedom-seeking people, including enslaved men, women, and children in the French islands of the Caribbean. He engages with questions about labor, geography, law, and European and indigenous sovereignty to understand how enslaved persons conceptualized refuge, liberty, and freedom based on their geopolitical knowledge of the world around them. His research has received support from the Fulbright France, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, as well as the Duke History and African American Studies departments. That's really impressive. You are currently, or he is currently, a Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Research Fellow, where he researches and interprets the history of enslaved people from the Chesapeake who joined the colonial Marines during the War of 1812. For those of you who are familiar with Sotterley's history, you know that is a major moment in the history of this site. Because in 1814, 49 enslaved pursued their own freedom, sought their own freedom, and took their own freedom from Sotterley during this moment in history. And so this is a great way, as I turn the program over to our esteemed speaker tonight, to take a big moment in history and bring it down to a local level. And so it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you all Dr. Tayzhuan Glover.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Is this good? Okay. Cool. Well, I'm so excited to be here. When Catherine reached out to me earlier this year about coming for the speaker series, there was no way that I would say no. So I'm excited to be here, excited to see this turnout. I hear there's a lot of people online, so I'm not sure where to look to see, I guess, here, but thank you all for tuning in. As Catherine mentioned a few moments ago, this topic and the subject and idea of freedom seeking on the from the Chesapeake, thinking about enslaved people and this country coming up on its 250th these are very important questions to think through. And so I'm excited to give you all this timely presentation. But before I get too deep into anything, I just want to give you all a quick overview of what I'm going to be doing. Just going to start with a brief narrative of some events that happened here at Sotterley during the War of 1812, just to sort of ground you all in the context of where this talk will be going. And then I just want to lay out some of the context for slavery in the Chesapeake, the context of the War of 1812, to think about what exactly the war was, why enslaved people were self-emancipating, and then I'll get into the fun stuff about the colonial marines and the migrations of Sotterley's enslaved to Trinidad in the aftermath of the war. Okay. Joshua Wood, Peregrine Young, Ignatius Seal, and James Bowie are the names of 4 enslaved men who lived and labored on the grounds on which we sit here at Sotterley Plantation in 1814, when the property was under the ownership of Colonel John Rousby Plater. In the summer of that year, these 4 men were presented with a rare opportunity. 2 years before, in 1812, the United States had become entangled in a second war for independence from Great Britain. This war is known today as the Anglo-American War, or simply the War of 1812. British warships had been entering the waters around southern Maryland and Virginia that make up the Chesapeake Bay region, with the intention of gaining access to and destroying the United States' economic centers in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Finally, after months of raids and battles in the region, the British ships had arrived in St. Leonard's Creek on the western shores of the Patuxent River in the summer of 1814, just within sight of Sotterley Plantation. From the veranda of the main house, and perhaps from the doorways of the dwellings in which the enslaved resided, these 4 men would have seen the squadron of British ships under the command of Captain Brown and Captain Norse anchor at the mouth of the creek. For Plater and the other white property owners in the area, the arrival of the British was certainly a cause for grave concern. After all, the British had made a regular practice of pillaging and plundering the properties and towns along the Chesapeake's waterways since the start of the war. Yet for the enslaved at Sotterley and elsewhere, the arrival of the British meant something else. Though much of their lives may have revolved around their labor on this plantation, these 4 men were likely made aware of the war through news that for 2 years had spread orally through the region by highly mobile individuals, including enslavers, enslaved laborers, traders, people on neighboring plantations and farms, and British and American soldiers. And so it's likely that they would have learned of the freedom that the British extended to the enslaved, who offered them their skill and labor. So together on June 12, 1814, Joshua Wood, Peregrine Young, Ignatius Seal, and James Bowie removed themselves from this plantation, rowing out to the British ships on the river, and emancipated themselves. 210 years ago, almost to the day, with 210 years and a month ago, they embarked on a journey that would bring them more than 2,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean to Trinidad in the southeastern Caribbean. And so the War of 1812 was a brief yet significant moment in American history that is often overshadowed by the American Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. The war itself was a bridge between these two moments, revolving around issues concerning the future of American independence from Great Britain and the United States' ability to expand its territory. At the same time, the conflict between the US and Great Britain raised a fundamental question about America's commitment to its self-proclaimed principles of independence and freedom. Freedom for whom? For enslaved people, including those held in bondage here at Sotterley, the principles of freedom and individual liberties that define the 1777 Articles of Confederation and the 1789 Constitution of the United States existed in direct contradiction to the lived realities of slavery at the beginning of the 19th century. The War of 1812 was one of several major episodes in American history in which military conflict created a series of openings through which enslaved people could liberate themselves, not just from their enslavers, but from a nation that sought to confine them. So this presentation grounds itself in the land here at Sotterley to explore this narrative of Black hope and freedom in the context of the War of 1812 that is directly connected to this site and the surrounding region. It's a history that highlights the autonomy of the hundreds of enslaved African Americans who chose to emancipate themselves and liberate themselves and their families from bondage. And so using archival materials housed in the Maryland State Archives, the Library of Virginia, the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, and the British National Archives in Kew, England, this presentation will follow Joshua Wood, Peregrine Young, Ignatius Seal, and James Bowie, and a host of other formerly enslaved African Americans through the Chesapeake and beyond to Trinidad to explore the lives and legacies of these freedom seekers during and after the war. Okay, so because I'm a historian, I love maps. And so I'm going to take a quick second to sort of ground everyone geographically in where the story is taking place. And so I'm certain that many of you here are familiar, but for those who may not be, and those online who are watching from places that are far from here, we are currently in the Chesapeake Bay. The bay is in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States and stretches about 200 miles from the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania and its northernmost boundaries down to the mouth of the bay where it meets the Atlantic Ocean between Cape Henry and Cape Charles in Virginia. The Chesapeake Bay encompasses the states of Maryland and Virginia, but is also a part of a larger watershed that includes parts of West Virginia, Washington, D.C., Delaware, Pennsylvania, and even New York. The bay is made up of an extensive shoreline of nearly 12,000 miles with over 150 rivers and 100,000 tributaries that flow into these rivers and streams. And it hosts a range of forests, wetlands, swamps, reefs, and beaches. And so it's precisely this kind of extensive network of waterways that gives a lot of shape and texture to this history of self-emancipation during the war. The history of the Chesapeake Bay itself is deeply entwined with that of slavery in the United States. The first enslaved Africans forcibly brought to the United States arrived in August of 1619 in what is now Fort Monroe in Virginia. Since the early 17th century, the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants was essential to the economic development of the Chesapeake and the US more broadly. Enslaved people's labor largely revolved around agricultural production, particularly of the cash crop tobacco. However, this labor also extended beyond tobacco farming on plantations to mixed farming of crops like corn and small grains on smaller farms, and it extended even further into the maritime industry that emerged here in the Chesapeake. African Americans, enslaved and free, were critical to the development and maintenance of the maritime industry of the Chesapeake Bay. They labored as shipbuilders, crew members, caulkers, carpenters, boat pilots, fishermen, and oyster harvesters. They were essential to networks of communication and the circulation of people, goods, and information among the Chesapeake, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Enslaved and free people guided large and small vessels through the bay's waterways and even used their access to the maritime industry to escape bondage, sometimes with the help of ship captains and sailors. And so a notable example of this is Frederick Douglass, who labored in the Baltimore shipyard as a caulker, where he acquired knowledge of ships and sailing that was essential to his escape in 1838 with his wife, Anna Murray. And so during his escape, he disguised himself in a sailor uniform and carried seaman protection papers that were given to American seamen to keep them safe from British impressment, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But it was through this kind of labor and mobility alongside generations of West Central African, Native American, and European maritime practices that generations of African Americans acquired extensive knowledge of the Chesapeake's waterways and piloting and maritime navigation that connected the people of the Chesapeake to one another and beyond. And so in some ways, Sotterley Plantation is like a microcosm of this broader maritime industry and world in which it's sitting. The plantation sits on the western shores of the Patuxent River in St. Mary's County, Maryland. And in the 18th and 19th century, the Patuxent River itself was a significant waterway in Maryland, serving as a vital transportation route for regional and intercontinental trade. Large ships, smaller sailing vessels, and later steamboats would have connected the towns and tobacco ports along the river to Baltimore. And so Sotterley had direct access to these shipping lanes that ran along the Patuxent. And in fact, Sotterley's wharf was specifically a hub for exporting goods like tobacco, corn, and lumber that were produced here on the plantation and for importing goods from Europe. The wharf is also notably a documented landing site for enslaved Africans who were imported into the Chesapeake through the transatlantic slave trade. But at the same time, the plantation was also a documented site of departure for enslaved people who took their freedom during the War of 1812. And so I want to take a second to read this quote from John Rowsby Plater in 1821, which comes from the property claim he submitted after the war for compensation for property lost to the British, which I'll get into in just a few minutes. But the quote here says, "The situation of my residence being immediately on the waters of the Patuxent and opposite to St. Leonard's Creek, where the British ships were at anchor blockading Commodore Barney, and my whole entire estate within their power and possession, and this river being exclusively in their possession to the close of the war, the loss of all my crops added to the great one sustained in Negroes nearly ruined me." And so as a historian of slavery, one of the tough parts of my job is looking for enslaved people in these documents that talk around them, that talk over them, or talk through them, and sort of trying to understand what this would have meant to enslaved people. And so one of the things that I've thought of when I saw this immediately was sort of flipping the perspective and thinking about how he's lamenting his location on the river as it sort of gave the British access to his property, and sort of thinking about it instead as the location giving the enslaved access to the British, right? And so I'll go discuss this in further detail as I go more in depth about the war. Okay. The War of 1812 began on June 18th, 1812 in the shadow of the American Revolution. Put simply, the American Revolution from 1775 to 1783 was a political and military struggle that led to the independence of the 13 British colonies in what would become the United States. British colonists protested taxes imposed by the British government without representation in Parliament, and Great Britain's attempts to exert greater control over the colonists. In the aftermath of the Revolution, the 13 British colonies gained independence from Great Britain under the Articles of Confederation and later the US Constitution. However, the new and rapidly evolving independent nation was faced with asserting and defending its rights against Great Britain. The United States' decision to declare war against Great Britain was the culmination of several issues that had developed between these two nations following the end of the Revolution. Leading up to the war, Great Britain was heavily involved in the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815, which was a period of extensive conflict between Great Britain and France that began as a continuation to the French Revolutionary Wars. And so during these wars, Great Britain and France engaged in commercial warfare at sea to weaken each other's economies. And as a neutral trading nation with its own tensions with Great Britain, American citizens and the nation's economy became caught in the crossfire. Because the wars with France were Great Britain's primary focus in the early 19th century, the British were in constant need of sailors, and so they practiced impressment, which was the act of forcibly recruiting men to join the British Royal Navy, often by stopping and searching ships at sea, many of which were American merchant ships. All of this under the guise of retrieving British subjects who had been avoiding military service by working on American vessels. Press gangs, acting under the authority of the Royal Navy, would seize men from port towns or board ships to forcibly enlist them. Many of the thousands of American sailors who were taken away from American ships through British impressment were naturalized American citizens of British descent, while plenty others were American-born sailors. And so the seaman papers that Frederick Douglass was carrying that I mentioned earlier would have been to protect sailors from this practice, to sort of prove that they were American citizens and not British subjects to be retrieved. And so the Chesapeake Leonard Affair of 1807 was an incident in which the British warship, the HMS Leopard, fired upon and boarded the American frigate USS Chesapeake, leading to the capture of 4 American sailors, which sort of heightened tensions between the US and Great Britain. The American public understood this practice to be a violation of American sovereignty and an insult from Britain, and it also disrupted American shipping and trade, fueling a growing sense of resentment towards Great Britain. And so these trade restrictions that Great Britain imposed on the US was an additional source of tensions between the two nations. And perhaps more troubling than the problems of British impressment and trade restrictions was the issue of Great Britain hindering American expansion. Although Great Britain didn't have any official policies in place to prohibit or hinder US expansion, their involvement with Native American groups was understood to be a major obstacle to American expansion. In the early 19th century, Native American groups, especially those in the Great Lakes region and in frontier states, which included at the time Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and parts of Missouri and Arkansas, maintained varying degrees of alliance with British colonial authorities. This created a public perception that Native Americans on the border of the United States and Canada and in frontier states were in cahoots with the British to prohibit expansion. And so all of these issues sort of culminated in the decision of President James Monroe on June 12th of 1812 to declare war against Great Britain to remove British influence from North America altogether. And so the war began with the American invasion of Upper Canada and the Niagara frontier, where British land claims were weakly defended. However, American invasion was unsuccessful and ended in defeat for American forces. But the war was not over. Great Britain retaliated with a new plan to invade the Chesapeake Bay, which gave direct access to the United States' major political and economic centers. They hoped to relieve pressure on Canada and cripple the American economy from within the country. And so, when the British arrived in the Chesapeake Bay in the winter of 1813, many enslaved people sought their freedom by rowing out to British boats, usually in the night. But such attempts were relatively small until the spring of 1814, when British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane issued a proclamation on April 2nd, offering persons who were resident in the United States and received on board any Royal Navy ship the opportunity to emigrate with their families to British possessions in North America and the Caribbean as free settlers. And so the strategic wording of the proclamation, which I have up here, didn't explicitly refer to enslaved people, though Admiral Cochrane did intend to draw the enslaved to the British side. Cochrane, an enslaver himself with previous military experience in the French Caribbean, recognized the value and potential that enslaved people could offer the British. After all, enslaved people here in the Chesapeake had knowledge of local waterways and land travel that was useful to the British. And so this kind of political move was not unfamiliar to the British. During the American Revolution, the 1775 Dunmore Proclamation, signed by John Murray, the royal governor of the British colony of Virginia at the time, promised freedom to indentured servants and enslaved people who joined the British Army, leading to the self-emancipation of nearly 2,000 enslaved people and the formation of the Ethiopian Regiment. The enslaved who experienced the War of 1812, particularly in Virginia, were only one generation removed from those who had lived through the American Revolution. And so it's quite possible that this earlier history of the British offering freedom to the enslaved lived on in the cultural memory of the enslaved who were experiencing the War of 1812, giving some of them the courage to seize the opportunity to self-emancipate on the British side. In many ways, joining the British side was mutually beneficial for both the British and the enslaved. As I mentioned, the enslaved were valuable sources of knowledge and information that was useful to the British, but for the enslaved, the promises of the proclamation itself was a tangible path to freedom. Though the future of their lives and freedom was not necessarily certain or clear. Through the course of the war, the news of Cochrane's proclamation spread with the movement of British soldiers on land and by word of mouth, and more than 4,000 enslaved people who became aware of the proposition self-emancipated with the British in hopes of building a future for themselves and their families in freedom. And so I want to pause here for a second to sort of emphasize that the proclamation itself comes out of a very complicated moment. It's not necessarily it was not necessarily developed as an act of kindness or genuine concern for the well-being of enslaved people. And this was sort of a practice that the British and the French and other European powers had been engaging in for quite a while in the US and the Caribbean, offering emancipation in exchange for military service during campaigns with varying degrees of success. And so historian Matthew Taylor, who's written a book called The Black Redcoat, sort of digs in a little deeper into Admiral Cochrane's journals and papers and sort of thinking about the conflicted feelings he himself had in terms of thinking about enslaved people as both property and human beings and sort of trying to wrestle with the humanity of it all. But we do know that regardless of how this came about, it was fairly effective in the War of 1812, and the practice itself was quite successful. But how do we know this? The details of these enslaved people removing themselves from bondage appear in numerous places in the British and American archives that document the war. Correspondence among British military officers and ship captain logs held at the National Archives in England detail, though rather briefly, the arrival of enslaved families to British ships that were anchored in the Chesapeake's waterways. The most detailed accounts of enslaved people taking their freedom come in the form of property claims submitted in the 1820s under the first article of the Treaty of Ghent. Essentially, the Treaty of Ghent ended the war in 1815, and enslavers in the US were able to submit these property claims for property lost to the British during the war to receive compensation. And so this property included like anything that was like burned, stolen, including enslaved people. And so hundreds of enslavers in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. submitted these claims, many of which are housed digitally at in the War of 1812 collection at the Maryland State Archives and physically at the Library of Virginia and at the National Archives in College Park. And so these property claims are essentially files or like compilations of files that sort of include enslavers' testimonies of the events of the War of 1812 that sort of led to their property being stolen by the British. They also include testimonies from neighbors, other enslavers, relatives, plantation managers, just anyone who can sort of corroborate the details that the enslavers are writing in their claims. And so a lot of these claims, which were submitted about 5 to 6 years after the war, the details are relatively general, and they sort of follow like a general narrative of the British came, they raided, the enslaved left with them. Here's the names, ages, and values of all of these people that I want compensation for. But there is a small number of claims that were submitted in Northumberland County, Virginia during the war, which are far more detailed and include a lot of eyewitness accounts of folks self-emancipating. And so I'd be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But it's through these kinds of claims that we learn more about these self-emancipators, and it's through specifically James Rousby Plater's claim submitted on June 20th, 1821, that we know of Joshua Wood, Peregrine Young, Ignatius Seal, and James Bowie, whose stories open this talk. But the big question is what happened to them after they escaped. And so these four men's experience of freedom with the British was one that wasn't necessarily unusual for enslaved men who self-emancipated to the British side during the war. We learn from the testimony of Joseph Brewer, a quote from his testimony is here on the screen. He was the manager of Sotterley Plantation in 1812, and his testimony is a part of the documents that make up Plater's property claim. We learned that several days after the four men took their freedom, they led the British back to Sotterley to free another 45 enslaved people, including women and children, which effectively made Sotterley Plantation, the site of the largest group of self-emancipators in the state of Maryland during the war. And so these instances of self-emancipated individuals and small groups leading the British back to former sites of enslavement to free others appear across other property claims that were submitted in Maryland and Virginia, which I can elaborate on in the Q&A. But here we see just a quote from Brewer's testimony. He mentions that on the same night, the barges of the British squadron in the Patuxent River took from the Mansion estate nearly all of the Negroes of the said Colonel Plater. And he further disposeth that the month preceding to it, June, a squadron under the command of Captain Brown of the Loire, which is one of the British Royal Navy ships, took on board and carried away Joseph Wood, aged about 19, Peregrine, James Bowie, and Ignatius Seal. Okay. So these sort of details that we get from the various testimonies that are a part of these property claims give us a lot of information about the details of the actual escape, but we can also look beyond the property claims to sort of think bigger about the story that we have here. And so British records corroborate the details in these claims. Sotterley's self-emancipators appear on the muster list of the HMS Loire on June 20th, 1814, alongside dozens of other freedom seekers from the Chesapeake who found their way to the same British ship in the summer of 1814. And I did not anticipate how small the text would be in the image when I made this. So I wish that I had zoomed in a little bit. But if I were to have zoomed in, you'd see that here we have the lists of all of the names of enslaved people or self-emancipated folks who are on the HMS Loire. These two records are specifically from the Severn, which is the ship they were transferred to after spending time on the Loire. But we see that we have the first and last name. We have place of origin, which in this case is just written as Patuxent River with the date on which they arrived. And from about here down to about the middle of the page about here is just an entire list of all of the men, women, and children who self-emancipated from Sotterley and were confirmed to have been on the HMS Severn. And so we see here that they are on these ships. We have a lot of these records for the British ships. The British were very meticulous record keepers. And so for any of the ships that were used during the War of 1812 that were present in the Chesapeake, there is a muster list of this sort that would exist. And if you go through the dates and get to the end of the pages where there's usually a list that says like Black refugees or African American refugees or colonial Marines, you'll be able to find these kind of lists of individuals with first and last name divided by pages for men and then pages for women and children as well. We also learn from the June 20th, 1814 entry in the captain's log for the HMS Loire that Captain Smith had received on board the ship several Black men and women, and all the boats of the different ships of the squadron sent the Black people to the admiral. So essentially, he's talking in this very, very brief entry, he's talking about how all of the smaller boats that were attached to the larger British ships were brought to shore. The enslaved from Sotterley boarded those smaller boats and then rowed back out to the HMS Loire, where they were given refuge and British protection. And so all of these details that we get from these sources outside of the property claims are consistent with Joseph Brewer's claim that Wood, Young, Seal, and Bowie led the British back to Sotterley to free the rest of the enslaved here. And so one of the questions that comes out of this is like, who were the Black men and women that are very briefly mentioned as having arrived on this ship? And so though the content of Plater's property claim is fairly consistent with all the rest in terms of the numbers of testimonies that can corroborate the details that he is claiming, we also have two pages that are quite rare, which are lists of the African-American men, women, and children who were on board the British vessels provided to him by the British captains themselves. And so Captain Thomas Smith of the HMS Loire and Captain Norse of the Severn provided Plater with these lists of Sotterley's freedom seekers who were on board their ships between June and September of 1814. And so again, I didn't realize how small this would be, but you can kind of see here that we have like first and last names of folks. We see that we also have the ages of people and the value they would have had that Plater was seeking compensation for. And so from these lists, we see that these are people who are as young as like 6 months old as 60 years old. We see a lot of the same last names coming up for individuals. It's the Monroe families, the Seal families, the Young family, the Corseys. And so we see from all of these details that this isn't necessary. This idea of self-emancipation during the War of 1812 isn't necessarily just a history about enslaved men fighting in a war. It's not just about like the battles or the uniforms, but this is about enslaved families, enslaved people navigating cracks in the system of slavery that are sort of created by this context of war to sort of maintain familial and kinship structures as they liberate themselves into freedom. And so as we sort of explore the weight and legacy of this history, it sort of means like looking beyond the moment of self-emancipation to consider where freedom took these folks. So we enter the colonial Marines. On June 12, 1814, the same day they self-emancipated, Joshua Wood, Peregrine Young, Ignatius Seal, and James Bowie each enlisted in the Colonial Corps of Marines, or simply the Colonial Marines. The Colonial Marines was a regiment of nearly 200 self-emancipated African-American soldiers who fought on the British side during the war. They were equipped with useful knowledge of the geography and lands of waters around the Chesapeake, and they were trained on Tangier Island, Virginia, and issued arms to fight side by side with British troops. They participated in many raids on the Chesapeake, including the British March on Washington, D.C. on August 24, 1814, which resulted in the burning of the White House and Capitol building. They participated in the barge on Fort McHenry and the Battle of North Point in September of that same year. And the events at Fort McHenry famously inspired Francis Scott Key's poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, which became the Star-Spangled Banner national anthem in 1931. And so while all of this was happening, many of the wives and children and other relatives of the colonial Marines maintained their freedom under British protection on Tangier Island, and later Ireland Island in Bermuda until the end of the war. But I'll get to that in a second. Tangier Island was a major site of activity for the British and self-emancipated during the war. In April of 1814, the British established Fort Albion on the island under the direction of Admiral George Cockburn. The fort included barracks, a hospital, a church, and family dwellings to house the 1,200 British troops who were documented to have been present there at one point or another during the war. But it was also a site through which nearly 1,000 self-emancipators who found refuge on British ships were received. Those who joined the Colonial Marines were trained here before participating in British military campaigns, and other self-emancipated people, particularly women and children, performed various tasks including food preparation, clothing repair, and sanitation for the British troops. When the war came to an end in 1815, those who had not chosen to enlist in the war effort with the British and remained on Tangier Island under British protection were resettled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so this included the Monroe, Seal, including Ignatius Seal, and Corsey families from Sotterley Plantation. These families joined a community of more than 3,000 African Americans around Halifax who freed themselves with the British during the Revolutionary War. And together, these African Americans developed communities around Halifax, including Preston, Hammond's Plains, and Beachville, that shaped what has become the Black Nova Scotian identity. So a lot of the documents that are directly related to that history of the folks who ended up in Nova Scotia are available on the Nova Scotia Archives online database. And you'd specifically look for like the Book of Negroes, which is a list of all the African Americans who resettled there. And for the War of 1812, you'd look for the Halifax list, which is a similar list, but just for the War of 1812. The site also hosts a lot of other digitized content related to the waves of African American settlers and their descendants from the 1750s through about the 1950s. And so I highly recommend browsing those sites if you're interested in like the histories of slavery in Canada or genealogical projects or anything of the sort. There's also a list of resources I prepared to share at the end of this presentation that I'm sure Catherine will help make available to you all. So cool, they'll be on the website. Cool. Oh, and just a quick note, Due to climate change and like rising sea levels, Fort Albion on Tangier Island is currently underwater. But you can visit the rest of Tangier Island and the museum there between about late May and like early October-ish. The site itself is also a part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom for serving as a site of refuge for these 1,000 self-emancipators during the war. And so there's a rich history there that's deeply entwined with the War of 1812. And there'll be more resources for looking into that on the document I just mentioned. Okay. On February 17th, 1815, the Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812. In March and April of that same year, the British evacuated Tangier Island. British ships HMS Orlando and the Regulus brought hundreds of freedom seekers, including the colonial Marines and their families, to Ireland Island in Bermuda from Tangier Island. While on Ireland Island, self-emancipated people labored in building works alongside enslaved Bermudans in the Royal Navy dockyard under the supervision of the British, and the colonial Marines likely participated in the defense of the dockyard itself. However, extending their labor to the British military was not what defined their time on Ireland Island. The site was a site of collective organizing and self-advocacy for the colonial Marines and their families, which was crucial to shaping what would become their futures in freedom. The British entertained more than one plan for managing the large group of self-emancipated people under their protection, which included folding the colonial Marines into the British West India Regiment to continue to benefit from their military labor. These offers were communicated to the sergeants and corporals of each company of colonial Marines, who then deliberated with the soldiers and their families under their authorities. The colonial Marines and their families collectively rejected offers to continue serving under the British, even in regiments of their own. They stood firmly on seeing through Admiral Cochrane's offer of resettling as free people on land given to them in a British colony. And so the British agreed to resettle the colonial Marines and their families in Trinidad as independent farmers. And so this is a document that I found in the National Archives in England that sort of documents Admiral Coburn talking about how these plans to do other things with the colonial Marines or resettle them elsewhere were communicated to them. Then the colonial Marines collectively notified their unanimous desire not to be formed into independent communities, but to accept the alternative of being disbanded and conveyed to Trinidad, there to be settled as many others of their countrymen have been already established, referring to folks who made it to Nova Scotia. And so the question is, why Trinidad? The British had formally acquired Trinidad from the Spanish in 1802, and the small island colony was relatively underdeveloped compared to larger British colonies like Jamaica and Barbados. So it essentially had a large amount of uncultivated land in the south of the island, and it was in need of a new labor supply. The British 1807 abolition of the slave trade meant that no enslaved Africans could legally be imported into the colony, and attempts to import European and Chinese laborers were relatively unsuccessful. The British government and the governor of Trinidad agreed on the idea of establishing a free class of Black farmers to help develop the island of Trinidad. The colonial Marines and their families were the prime candidates for this experiment in colonial development. So they accepted the British government's proposal to resettle in Trinidad, and the first group arrived there from Bermuda on August 20th, 1860 on board the HMS Karen. And subsequent groups would arrive until 1820 on the Levant, Sealand, and Ardent. And so here I have a map from John McNish Weiss's book, The Merikins, Free Blacks, American Settlers in Trinidad, which sort of helps to detail the movement of the colonial Marines through the Chesapeake down into the South and then to Bermuda and Trinidad. And so one element of the story that I sort of breezed over is that as the British moved south after leaving the Chesapeake after their campaigns there, they moved into the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, and Louisiana in the summer of 1814. And so self-emancipated African Americans joined the colonial Marines and followed the British from those places as well. And so a lot of those same free people were also given passage to Trinidad, with the groups arriving in like May, July, and November of 1814. And so we see from the second map from John McNish Weiss's book that the different waves of settlers were settled in different areas, all in the south of Trinidad. These are collectively known as the company villages, but the folks from the Chesapeake were specifically settled here down in the south. All of this is like Naparima district. Okay. All right. Between 1815 and 1821, nearly 700 self-emancipators were resettled in 6 company villages in Trinidad at the instruction of Lord Bathurst, the British Secretary for War in the Colonies. 16 acres of land in the Naparima district in the south of Trinidad was distributed to each of the former soldiers and their families. These villages were organized based on their military companies, each of which were under the local supervision of their respective sergeants and corporals, who were also self-emancipated men from the Chesapeake. Although slavery was still legal in Trinidad until 1833, the resettled African Americans maintained their freedom and collectively lived under the protection of British Superintendent Robert Mitchell. Superintendent Mitchell sort of acted as a bridge between the company villages and the British administration in Trinidad. And so much of what we know about life in the villages in the early decades in which they were settled comes from documents that include reports on the health of the folks there, reproduction, agricultural production, and villagers' various requests to the government. And all of these documents were produced from Mitchell's periodic visits to the villages in the 1820s and 30s. Unfortunately, the archives go a bit silent around the mid-1830s after Superintendent Mitchell was no longer overseeing the company villages, but the scattered documents that remain from the 1840s through about the 1880s are incredibly brief reports from the Baptist missionaries who helped support the development of the Baptist Church in Trinidad. And so I want to go through a few sources that I found. Again, apologies. I'm going to apologize every time I show you an image with small text. But in 1821, one of Mitchell's visits to the company villages produced these sort of like pseudo census records of who is still remaining there. And so if we could see, we'd see that James Bowie is still, he's around here. Here he is, and he's married someone named Charlotte, and they have 2 children, 2 sons. Charlotte doesn't appear on any of the Sotterley records from the British ships or from anywhere in Plater's claim, and so it's very possible that she's someone that he met and married shortly after arriving in Trinidad, which I can talk a little bit more about during the Q&A if anyone's interested. But we also see that we don't see Peregrine Young in the Trinidad record, so his fate is unknown. It's possible that he may have gone to Nova Scotia, or that he remained in the US, or maybe he passed during the war. But we do know that James Bowie and Joshua Wood both made their way to Trinidad, and that they were living in the first company village under the leadership of Sergeant Thomas Shields, who was a self-emancipator from York County, Virginia, who basically self-emancipated with the British in January of 1814, along with 3 other people from his site of enslavement. All of them joined the Colonial Marines and rose in ranks to the level of sergeant. And so we see that he and the other company villages, the folks he fled with, were also here in Trinidad in the company villages. And then on the right here is sort of a list of folks who were ill in 1821, folks who had sores, stomach aches, eye sores. And these sort of documents were sort of produced so that Mitchell could communicate to the governor of Trinidad that they needed more medical supplies in the company villages. And so we see that one of James Bowie's sons is listed as having sores. Again, these documents are very vague and very brief. It's great that we have names, but we don't have too much else other than that. Because as I mentioned, Mitchell is sort of the middleman between the company villages and Trinidad's governor Woodford at the time. And so a lot of the requests that we see are sort of filtered through him. We get a lot of requests for like food, tools, supplies, and those are sort of corroborated through receipts from Trinidad's treasurer. So we see that these requests were being fulfilled, but we don't know too much about what was actually going on in the villages at the time. We also see that in the 1810s, folks in the company villages requested that they be reunited with family members who were resettled in Nova Scotia. And so the final wave of self-emancipators who came in 1821 were actually the families of those who were in Trinidad but separated because they ended up in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, that doesn't include any of the Sotterley folks, but we do see all sorts of requests come up in those documents, including some to have more religious instruction in the company villages. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these enslaved people who self-emancipated were coming from the Chesapeake, but a lot were also coming from the deeper South, where they would have been Baptist Christians. And so there's a huge sort of push to have a Baptist minister come to the company villages to help them build a church, to have a religious instruction and education for the villagers there. And so this is coming from 1823, Mitchell's visit to the company villages, where we see him writing to the Governor Woodford of Trinidad, asking if the Treasury has money that they will allow for a clergyman for the American refugees, as well as towards the building of a church and parsonage house. And so we see that there is a lot of activity happening in the company villages. It's just a matter of scouring the archives to find documents that actually discuss what's going on there, which is a challenge in itself. Okay. And so the conditions of freedom and resettlement in Trinidad were not all that these formerly enslaved people imagined. In addition to a lack of clothing and supplies, the gender imbalance of the community, and disease in the company villages, these families faced tensions with the local population of free people of color. A group of free people of color who'd been living in and around Naparima unsuccessfully petitioned to the governor of Trinidad to settle the colonial Marines and their families elsewhere shortly before the first arrival in 1815. They opposed the idea of self-emancipated African-descended settlers with military training living in proximity to enslaved people on properties that were near the company villages, fearing that rebellions would ensue if these enslaved people mingled with these freed people from the United States. Beyond these tensions with the local population, some of the villages were located on lands with poor soil, and like African-American settlers in Nova Scotia, those in Trinidad were not granted ownership of those lands on which they lived. This would change, however, in 1847 under the direction of Governor George Harris of Trinidad. Yet despite these challenges, the African-American settlers developed a distinct community. As farmers, they provided for themselves by growing corn, pumpkin, plantain, and rice. Whatever was left over was sold at local markets, and many individuals who chose to work on nearby sugar estates or found work as blacksmiths, carpenters, and other traders still maintained their claim to the lands on which they settled. Within a decade of their arrival, the settlers even petitioned for resources to establish their own schools and churches, laying the foundation for what would become the spiritual Baptist denomination in Trinidad today. Many of the descendants of these settlers still live in Trinidad, and some still in the original towns formed in 1815. The descendants of the self-emancipated African Americans who have been the focus of this presentation today refer to themselves as Merikins, a term derived from American that recognizes and honors both the community's historical and cultural connections to the United States and the legacy of their self-emancipating ancestors. Common surnames among the descendants include McNish, Saunders, Kinsel, Mitchell, Thompson, Loney, Dunmore, Elliott, Shields, Braxton, Jackson, and Woods, likely tracing back to Joshua Wood from Sotterley. The Americans remain connected to their history and heritage through oral histories and community organizing and programming. The Merikin Heritage Foundation is one of several organizations that were created and operated by descendants that is dedicated to preserving and sharing the history and culture of the Americans. The foundation has organized programming around the story of the colonial Marines, including American heritage tours, conferences, and demonstrations as part of Trinidad's annual African Emancipation Day celebrations in August. in partnership with the National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago, the United Maroons, Indigenous Peoples Organization, and other partners and shareholders. And so this image that I have here, I actually found on the Merikin Heritage Foundation's Facebook page, and it is sort of American children dressed as colonial Marines during a celebration that's had during the African Emancipation Day celebrations in August. And so I think this image was from maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So this is still a very active organization to this day. In 2016, the American Heritage Foundation collaborated with the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago to build an exhibit titled Celebrating the Americans, Our Heritage, Our Faith, Our Future, an American collection of archival records, books, videos, and other resources to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the arrival of the colonial Marines and their families in Trinidad, which is an incredibly valuable source for learning more about this history. And so to conclude, I plan to continue this research on this history over the next year with an archival research trip to Trinidad, which in theory would have been planned for much earlier in the summer, but I'm going to push it back to December. And I hope that will allow me to connect with the American Heritage Foundation and the descendant community more broadly to learn more about the lives of colonial Marines and their families in Trinidad. I've also been hearing about this like book of documents that's like in the basement at the University of the West Indies. And so I just need to confirm if that's there and see what's in it. I'm also in the early stages of developing a traveling exhibit about this history in collaboration with Chesapeake Gateways that will be held here at Historic Sotterley along with other sites in the Chesapeake that are connected to this history. And then there'll be a digital version of that same exhibit that'll be more easily accessible online to folks who are not able to see it in person. And so in the meantime, I've also compiled this short list of resources that you all can use on your own, like research on this subject using digitized materials at the Maryland State Archives, National Archives in College Park, and the Library of Virginia in Richmond, as well as other archives in the US, England, Scotland, and Trinidad. And so at this time, I ask you all to ask questions. I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, guys, so how I'd like to work this so that everybody online can actually hear what's going on. If you have questions, just raise your hand. Let me bring you the microphone. You get to be a rock star and talk in the microphone and ask the questions that way. And Catherine will be monitoring the chat. And if we have any questions from online, she can bring them up. So first of all, do we have any questions here from the audience? I see you back there. I'm coming.
You said that after the war that a lot of them were offered to go to the West Indies, but since they were still fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, were any of them during 1812 moved over there, or were they just mostly kept here because they knew the waterways?
So they were mostly kept here, and a lot of them fought in the campaigns that were based in the US, so in the Chesapeake and even down into the Carolinas and New Orleans. After that part, the British weren't really focused. The British were really like annoyed about the War of 1812. It was sort of, in British history, it was sort of like a blip in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. And so they weren't trying to invest too many resources in this war because they were focused a lot more on the Napoleonic Wars. And so a lot of them, actually none of them participated in the Napoleonic Wars. They sort of were held in Tangier Island, and then some in Ireland Island, and then folks were just resettled once the war ended.
Yeah. Be right up there to you, just like.
Yes. Are you aware of the minute books from St. Mary's County commissioners from the War of 1812? In the book is listed of all the farmers and plantation owners petitioned the commissioners from St. Mary's County for reimbursement for loss of property. It's over in the St. Mary's County Historical Society, the minute books from that time of war.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I knew that they existed, but I haven't been able to get there to actually see them in person. So I've been using a lot of the digitized content on Maryland State Archives, but Thank you for reminding me of that.
Great when you can get a resource coming in like that.
Yeah.
We understand from the work of the Southern Maryland Equity and History Coalition that any number of individuals who fled to freedom, especially from the Calvert side that we're more familiar with, fled with their families. And I can imagine that, and many of them would flee and then come back, get their families, and continue on to the British ships. Was this a complication in terms of dealing with not only the individual who would go into the Marines, but also dealing with her family as well?
Yeah, so the sense that I get, there's always a level of danger at any point in the process of self-emancipation. And in a lot of the documents, there are numerous cases where enslavers try very hard to get their property back, whether they're going on to British ships themselves to actually confront ship captains or the enslaved, or if folks who know the enslavers or know an enslaved person to, or know a self-emancipator to have been enslaved by a specific individual, are also a part of this process of trying to get them back. And so there is always a level of danger. In a lot of cases where folks are coming back, they're coming back with the British, not just by themselves as free people. And so the British there's always like a level of confrontation, but also protection that they have by bringing British soldiers with them to help them emancipate their families. Yeah.
Dave, did you?
Professor Glover, thank you for an extremely informative presentation, from which I learned quite a bit. One of the things I learned was something we had long suspected, which is that when the British came back down the bay after burning Washington and the large escape of families from Sotterley took place, we all suspected that one or another of the young men who had escaped in June must have led the British back and helped arrange that. But you've now expanded my knowledge by giving me an actual source to prove that. The other thing we didn't know, that I gather you still don't know, is what happened to Peregrine Young and Ignatius Seal. I know you're doing more research. If you could find their stories out for us, it would be a huge help. Thank you very much.
I'm just curious, could you tell me about what year England prohibited the institution of slavery in that country?
Yes, 1833 was when the British killed the document to abolish slavery, but it went into effect in 1834. Yeah.
So they were dealing with emancipating enslaved people here, but it was still legal in England at that time.
Yeah.
Catherine, I'll be right back to you in just a second. I'm going to take Diane, and then I have a question from in the back.
In the coalition that my husband spoke about, we trained teachers about Southern Maryland history. And one of the examples we use is, why did the enslaved from here know about the British? But many of them couldn't read. How did they know? And then all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. Oh, they were parked right outside their door. But I am intrigued by what you briefly mentioned about the cultural heritage of emancipation, self-emancipation with the British in the Revolution. Could you expound on that?
Yeah, so a lot of the folks who joined the Ethiopian Regiment during the American Revolution were following the Dunmore Proclamation, which was issued in Virginia. And so a lot of folks who were enslaved in Virginia would have made up that regiment. And so the events of the Revolution and the War of 1812 are only separated by just a few short decades. And so even though a lot of people were resettled in Nova Scotia in these earlier waves that sort of build up the, I guess, African American heritage of the area around Halifax, Nova Scotia, not everyone chose to go to Nova Scotia. Others were just returned back into, some were re-enslaved, some were maintained their freedom but still stayed in Virginia. And so there's always this possibility that this kind of like history is shared through like oral history, word of mouth. It sort of influences the decisions that folks are making later on. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Brittany, I'll be right back to you. Let me take the one back there, and then Miss Brittany Hall, I'll be back to you in just a second. Miss Catherine, what do you have online for me?
So we actually have several questions online. The first one is, what's the population of the descendants of the Americans in Trinidad today, and do they identify with their Chesapeake origins?
Ooh, that's a good one.
So I've tried to get like exact numbers on this, and from what I'm seeing, it's in the like tens of thousands, like the high tens of thousands. And there is a sense of pride that descendants have in being descended from this history. A lot of folks are still like actively learning that they have these connections. A lot of folks are actually still in the U.S., are in the U.S. now from Trinidad. There's an episode of Drain the Oceans, like a National Geographic documentary about this exact topic, but centered on the events that took place on Coratoman Estate in Virginia. And Tina Dunkley, she's an artist of Trinidad origin. She lives in the US, and she sort of through her own family history project learned that she was descended from one of the self-emancipators from that estate who was resettled in Trinidad. And so there's still a lot of history that people are learning and taking pride in, and it's really hard to get those actual numbers because people are very concentrated in Trinidad, but also very spread out elsewhere. What was the second part of that question?
I think you kind of answered it, which was do they identify with their Chesapeake heritage and origin?
Yes.
And that's a good answer.
Catherine, I'll be right back to you. Let me take this one over here from Brittany. Just one second.
Thank you. Sorry, I kind of lost the question now. I really loved both your response here and also the overall framing of this project within the story of migration and understanding the sort of various routes that people have taken in this geographic, how special this geography is of the Chesapeake, that, you know, you have the first proclamation happening in Norfolk. It's, you know, there's all the way up, you know, to you know, Sotterley, Southern Maryland, and then, you know, further up, this, like you were saying, a developed sort of cultural heritage around you know, escaping, about seizing freedom, and that's so interesting to think that was consistently on the minds and within the worldview of these folks that are laboring through, you know, their forced bondage. So that's kind of exciting to give that agency to enslaved people as we imagine them today. I know we're here at Sotterley, but I'm also interested in kind of some of the, like, have you done any archival research outside of Maryland and Virginia, like through, you know, Delaware and the other watershed states?
Yeah, so I followed pretty narrowly the colonial Marines themselves, that was sort of my entry point into this. Josh McNish Weiss's book on the folks who are in Trinidad was a huge help in like figuring out the names of folks who actually came from the Chesapeake. But I haven't done too much else on the folks in Delaware and DC. Those documents are also a part of the property claims that are in the National Archives, but there are far fewer individuals sort of fled from Delaware and DC. And so the vast majority coming from Maryland and Virginia was where I initially set my focus. But I have time to expand. Yeah.
Catherine, back to you.
So we have a really good question. You brought up the exhibit in Trinidad from 2016. Are there any recordings or photos or resources that people could go to learn more about that exhibit?
Yeah, so there's on the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago's website, you'll be able to find the sort of resource guide about the Americans. And so on that PDF document, there's sort of like lists of the videos and recordings. There's also a YouTube page. If you just type in like Americans Trinidad, you'll get a lot of videos that are formally produced like by these foundations, but there's also some that are just sort of like travelers doing their own blogging about American history in Trinidad as well.
Did you say there was another one back there as well? Go ahead.
We have several more questions.
Okay, you go for it.
Outside of Trinidad, are there other countries in the Caribbean or islands in the Caribbean that have this historic connection to the Chesapeake region?
That's a good question. I'd have to do more research on it, like specifically the Chesapeake. I've heard rumors of folks from the Chesapeake who self-emancipated during the War of 1812 ending up in Jamaica, but I haven't confirmed that myself. So, but I'd say definitely like Bermuda, Trinidad are the two big ones for sure. Yeah.
So during the war, one person's asking about privateers and enslaved populations interacting or involvement with the privateers that were up and down the Chesapeake Bay and the Tidewater region. Is there any indication that enslaved or African Americans from the Chesapeake being involved with privateering?
Yeah, so there's, I think a lot of those kinds of details would come from some of the captain's logs and the admiral like correspondence papers that you can find in the National Archives. I know that there's some instances of, there's a whole separate dynamic of free African Americans who were involved in the war in various capacities, some with the British and in privateering, a lot on the American side as well. But there definitely are cases that you could find, yeah.
So we have two really good questions. Agnes Lightfoot, who is a Sotterley descendant, has asked if you have seen the surname Kane on any records pertaining to Trinidad and enslaved from the Chesapeake going there. So the Kane family, K-A-N-E-C-A-N-E, are deeply connected to the history of Sotterley.
I haven't seen any of the Kanes. Yeah, I haven't seen any in the records in Trinidad. I think the most that I see are the Buoys, the Woods. There are some Youngs, but I think they might be like a separate family of Youngs that are unrelated to Peregrine Young, but I haven't seen any Kanes.
The other question is, when the enslaved pursued their freedom and they went to Trinidad, were they Catholic or did they become Catholic or were they Protestant?
So initially the company villages were very, they were Baptist. They ended up getting a Baptist clergyman to come to the villages for a few decades between the 1840s and maybe like late 1890s. And so there's a digitized collection of the Baptist missionary newspapers that sort of document a lot of their travels through the Caribbean, and Trinidad always comes up as one of the islands that they're visiting consistently. They loved the company villages because folks were already Baptist, and so they didn't have to do a lot of work in converting. They just sort of supported what was already going on there and sort of use them as an example for other islands like Haiti or Jamaica, where they're also trying to convert folks. But I'd say contemporarily, it's very possible that folks are practicing Catholicism or Protestantism now. But the Baptist missionary, like Baptist faith in Trinidad is like uniquely coming out of the company villages and the African Americans who were resettled there.
Another one up here, Kat.
Could you compare the company villages of Trinidad with what appears to me to be the created villages of Nova Scotia?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, there are similar dynamics. Folks were sort of given the least favorable plots of land to live on and sort of cultivate. There was a general lack of resources that were given to them. And so a lot of folks remained on those lands. Some sort of branched out and lived elsewhere. In the company villages, by 1823, there are a lot of people who are listed as either gone or missing. And so some folks sort of lived in between the villages and not. Similar dynamic in Nova Scotia. The folks in Nova Scotia joining a community of African Americans who had been there for a few decades, also coming from the Chesapeake, sort of made it possible for them to make connections and whatnot that helped them survive a little closer. A lot of trade was still happening between the Chesapeake and Nova Scotia, and so there were even enslavers who went as far as Nova Scotia to try to convince folks to come back, whereas in Trinidad, there wasn't as much connection between the two spaces, and so the company villages remained relatively isolated down in the south of Trinidad, which were the lands that were very hard to access. Slave owners currently there didn't want those lands because they were so remote and difficult to get to. And so a lot of what we see come out of the company villages is a sort of, it's a culture that's sort of uniquely related to like largely the Chesapeake, but also the southern states where folks were coming from. But in Nova Scotia, we're just seeing more waves of African Americans coming in, and so the culture isn't quite the same. But there are different similarities in the conditions, but like differences in what comes out of those two spaces. Mm-hmm.
So, Catherine, did you say you had another one back there?
I have a couple of things. For me, as the interpretive programs manager, Peregrine Young is a big part of this story that we talk about, not only with the War of 1812 at Sotterley, but and emphasizing the lives of all of those who lived and labored here. Over the years, the story that I've heard about what happens with Peregrine is that he is on a British ship, the Albion, and that he dies on that ship at some point during or just after the war, and that ship was heading back to Britain. And so that's the story that we've heard over the years, but hopefully new research will give us more information about his life and what happens with his story, because it's always felt a little incomplete. The other thing is we are being asked a lot on online right now. Yes, this will be available online shortly after, hopefully at some point within the week, for those who are interested in watching this interesting presentation again.
Yeah, they couldn't take notes quickly enough, so they're going to want to see this again. Absolutely. Another one up here, just one sec.
I might have missed it, but do you know this was going on all up and down the bay?
Yes.
Do you know how many slaves total?
About 4,000 total.
Okay.
I know for certain that 1,000 who were present on Tangier came specifically from Maryland, Virginia, like Chesapeake area. But I think the numbers are quite higher than that in total.
Are you aware across the bay, the British sent a ship over, and the natives, locals, fought them off and captured all the British crew and sent them to jail in Cambridge, and they kept the cannon and called it the Becky Phipps, named after Lieutenant Phipps, the British, and the African American cook on board the ship, Becky.
Yeah,
they still have it, and it blew up, and they would fire it for special occasions, and it blew up on Woodrow Wilson's inauguration.
Yeah.
And Johnny, I swear, there's always going to be something else I learned from you.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I've been looking for Becky Phipps in the archives. Cannot seem to find her. That's back at Chesapeake Gateways. One of my coworkers, Kate, if she's watching, hey Kate, we have been obsessing over where Becky Phipps ended up after. No, the actual enslaved woman. Yeah. 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 We're trying to figure out what happened to Becky after the events. Can't seem to find her name. Yeah. Yeah. Gotta see it.
Make sure you raise your hand if you have something. I was wondering, do you have and I haven't ever heard this number, I don't think, people that self-emancipated but were recaptured, whether and were re-enslaved before they could actually make it to Trinidad or to Nova Scotia. I haven't heard much about that.
Yeah, the numbers on that I'm not too sure about. I know that there were cases of folks who made it to British ships. I see this. I've seen notes about this in the captain's log, specifically like with women. There's sort of ship captains talk about having these relationships with women who come on boat seeking refuge, but then they sort of like kick them off. And there's like these different levels of danger and uncertainty that do come from self-emancipating that I think sometimes get glossed over when we think about like the numbers of people who were successful in their attempts. There are cases of enslavers actually recapturing folks. They'll sort of come up in property claims, or maybe there's a few individuals who did make it away with the British, but they'll mention, well, we got back this one, but the other like 2 or 3 left with the British. So the numbers I think are small and hard to actually like put together, but it is something that does happen. Yeah.
Wait, here comes another one. Just one second.
So before the proclamation was issued, pretty much inviting them to come over and help free themselves, do you have any records that you found of enslaved people trying to essentially get picked up by press gangs, like using impressment as a way out, or would that not have been available to them?
I don't think that would have been available to them. They were specifically looking for British British soldiers, British sailors, I mean. And so they, I think, wouldn't necessarily have targeted African Americans in the same way that they would have people suspected to have been British. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the differences in how Lord Dunmore issued his proclamation, or the substance of that proclamation, versus Cochrane a couple of decades later?
Yeah. So Dunmore's proclamation was more of it was more of an on-the-fly kind of measure, in a sense that they needed to have more soldiers. They started to realize that they needed more manpower, and so they knew that there were some African Americans who they had been working with, and they understood that there was like a level of knowledge and expertise there that they could use to their advantage. And this is also happening at the same time that they're doing a similar thing in the Caribbean, in the Windward Islands. However, with Cochrane's proclamation, there are small numbers of self-emancipators who reach British ships leading up to the actual proclamation. And so it's just once we get to the proclamation that the numbers skyrocket, because now there's a sort of formal invitation, right? But I think in that sense, it was, at least with Cochrane's proclamation, there was a sense that there was opportunity there. And so he just came up with the proclamation and to help bolster his the British's plans to sort of break down the American economy from within the country itself. And so using enslaved people who had knowledge of these waterways that they were sort of navigating in depth for the first time, and thinking about land travel and ways of accessing Baltimore and Washington, D.C. was useful to them in a very particular context. Yeah.
Well, this was amazing. I mean, I'm glad we are going to be able to have this online, because otherwise they would be bugging you constantly to be able to repeat the whole thing. But it sounds like after your trip, we're going to have you back again. So I think there'll be a part 2 of this. And you were talking about the complications, especially women and families, what happened to them, their stories that may not be completely told. We did a War of 1812, a living history called The Choice, about you're making that choice. Why, what choice are you going to make when you find this opportunity? We ran it for 3 years. It's actually available. If you haven't seen it, it's available on our YouTube page. It's hyperlinked off the video, because history's complicated. And there were a lot of things that happened that we were still finding out the stories. And you shared so much of the stories with us tonight. Thank you so much for your time and your research. You were amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we will have, I hope you will join us next month on August 23rd. We are having our Day of Unity and Healing that is coming up. It will be actually held on the anniversary of, it's a UNESCO Day of Remembrance, and it will be the anniversary of the remembering the, now I'm going to get the name incorrect, Catherine, you have to tell me. It's the transatlantic slave trade, remembering that, and remembering those who escaped, those who were taken by it. So that Day of Remembrance will be here on our actual Day of Unity and Healing. We hope you're going to be here for that. Our next speaker series, I believe, is in September, and that's Franklin Robinson, correct? And Franklin Robinson owns Serenity Farms, and several years back, they found enslaved who were buried on his site, and we're going to find a little bit more about that as well, so that will be wonderful. So for those of you who joined us online, thank you so much. We're glad you could join us. For those of you here, we're glad you can join us. And Tayzhuan, thank you again. This was simply amazing.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.